All right, so let's take a look at page 55, 2.19. We're picking up with section 2, driving safely. So let's look at 2.19, skid control and recovery. And so we left off last time learning about anti-lock braking systems and this system that is in place to help prevent our wheels from locking up when we're hitting those brakes. If our wheels do lock up, some things can happen. And so the 2.19 talks about when a skid happens, essentially it means that the tires have lost their grip on the road. And another word for that is traction. So make sure you kind of understand that traction, tires losing their grip are the same thing, because the test may word it differently. Okay. And so when your tires lose grip, when you start to skid, it says this is caused in one of 4 ways. So these are the 4 ways in which you may cause a skid. And so the first is over braking. The second is oversteering, so just steering too sharply. Over acceleration, so providing too much power to the drive wheels may cause them to spin and again, don't have traction, and if you're in motion, could cause a skid. And then driving too fast. And it says the most serious skids result from driving too fast for road conditions. So just make note that 2.19 is explains the 4 causes of skids, and make sure you can recognize those on a test. Specifically, make note of the third one where it says over acceleration. So just that where you provide too much power to the drive wheels may cause them to spin, as there might be a question that asks you, what happens when you give too much power to, or supply too much power to the drive wheels? Well, you can cause them to spin and cause a skid. So now let's look at 2.19.1. So these are drive wheel skids. So some vehicles have front wheel drive, other vehicles have rear wheel drive. And so regardless of the vehicle, if you have wherever your drive wheels are, if you are start to have a skid, the way you recover from that skid is just by taking your foot off the accelerator. So here's another example where we don't hit the brakes, we just take our foot up off the accelerator. So if you see any questions that ask you, how do you recover from a skid? How do you prevent a skid? Take your foot off the accelerator will be the correct answer. It says the next line or next paragraph, first line of the next paragraph says rear wheel braking skids occur when the rear drive wheels lock. So make sure you make note of that. So again, some vehicles are front wheel drive, others are rear wheel drive. So make note of that. And then the last line that starts with sideways, pick up with that sentence that says, with vehicles towing trailers, a drive wheel skid can let the trailer push the towing vehicle sideways, causing a sudden jackknife. And that's what the figure to the right, figure 2.19, is demonstrating, is when the trailer starts to skid and pushes into the power unit, or what we'd call the cab or the truck part, and can push it sideways, then causing what's called a jackknife. So make sure you can kind of recognize what a jackknife looks like. So then we have 2.19.2, correcting a drive wheel skid. So this kind of reiterates the first part where we learned you just let your foot up off the accelerator. You pretty much also stop braking. So if you're braking while a skid begins, you stop that process. So that's the first way to correct a drive wheel braking skid. So when you stop braking, this will let the rear wheels roll again and keep them from sliding. And then the other thing you can do is counter steer. So as a vehicle turns back on course, it has a tendency to keep turning. And so if you counter steer, it could help offset that skid. So know that the 2 ways to correct a drive wheel braking skid is to stop braking and counter steer. The next paragraph says learning to stay off the brake. Just make note of that, because that's really, in a lot of these situations, what we have to learn, right? We have to learn not to hit those brakes. That's just another one of those situations where we don't hit the brakes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How long did the parapet?
So just make note of the first line that says, so 2.19.3, front wheel skids, driving too fast for conditions causes most front wheel skids. And what that means is if it's raining and you're driving and those front wheels lose traction and then that causes you to skid, that's so rain, snow, ice are all those conditions that you might have a front wheel skid. So that's all for that. We can flip over to page 56 and 2.20 accident procedures. Just make note of the 3 points there: protect the area, notify authorities, and care for the injured. It then goes into detail into each of those. And so let me just direct your attention to a few points. So 2.20.1, protect the area, is the first part of the accident procedure. Make note of the first bullet point that says if your vehicle is involved in the accident, try to get it to the side of the road. This will help prevent another accident and allow traffic to move. So, so if you are on the road, you want to get over to the side of the road so that traffic can continue going.
Okay.
So now let's look at 2.21 fires, because there may be a few questions on the test that ask you the causes of some fires and how to prevent fires. And so let's take a look at a few of those. So 2.21.1 causes of fire. Make sure you can recognize those causes of fire. Specifically, these are vehicle fires. And so the first is after accidents, then tires, electrical system, fuel, and cargo. So make sure you can recognize those 5 causes. Specifically, there may be a question about tires. So underinflated tires, specifically dual tires that touch, when they rub together and create that friction, could create a fire. And then cargo. If you have flammable cargo, if it's improperly sealed or there's poor ventilation, then that cargo could become flammable.
Okay.
So make note of those 2. Then we have 2.21.2 over on page 57, which talks about fire prevention. And pay attention to the first bullet point, pre-trip inspection. So you make a complete inspection of the electrical, fuel, exhaust systems, tires, and cargo. And you check to make sure your fire extinguisher is charged. And this is to prevent any fire, right? We never want a fire to happen. And the first point where we can ensure that that does not happen is during this pre-trip inspection, where we are looking at all of these items.
Okay.
Next, let's look at 2.21.3 firefighting. It's important to understand how to use a fire extinguisher. So just make note of these procedures that they talk about. So the first is, well, in the paragraph, it says, know how to use how the fire extinguisher works, study the instructions printed on the fire extinguisher before you need it. I think that's just a good general life lesson. I used to have a job where I managed housing for people. And one of the things that we did every year was teach the people in the housing that we managed how to use a fire extinguisher. And my first location that I worked at was in Alabama, and we were able to get the fire department out, and they actually were able to create a small fire in a contained fire in a some container that they had, and then everyone was able to practice using it. And so if you're not familiar with how to use it, you know, it's just good to understand that process, and those instructions are on the fire extinguisher. The next part says pull off the road. So the first step is to get the vehicle off the road and stop. And then just make note of those 3 bullet points. So you park in an open area away from buildings, trees, brush, other vehicles. Don't pull into a service station, right, where there's other flammable things. And then you notify emergency services of your problem and location. Those 3 bullet points there. And now let's go down to extinguish the fire. And I just want to draw your attention to the first bullet point where it says, when using the extinguisher, stay as far away from the fire as possible. So you don't actually want to get close to the fire, but you stay as far back as possible, so then let the fire extinguisher reach the fire. So the other bullet point says aim at the source or base of the fire, not up in the flames, and that will help douse the source of the fire.
Like at the bottom?
Yep.
Okay.
So the next section goes into how to, or it goes into the different types of fire extinguishers that you may have. And so you may see a question or two on the test that asks you to essentially make this connection between the class of fire extinguisher and what it puts out, essentially what types of fires it puts out. And so make note of all of the bullet points there under use the right fire extinguisher. And all of these bullet points are actually also shown in the figures to the right. So figures 2.20 and figure 2.21 show you these, an example of what these bullet points are talking about. And so, so if you go to the first bullet point, it says the BC fire extinguisher is designed to work on electrical fires and burning liquids. And so that an example of burning liquid would be fuel or gasoline. And then the second bullet point says the ABC type is designed to work on burning wood, paper, and cloth. And so because of these, you'll see that in our school buses, we have ABC fire extinguishers that cover electrical fires, burning liquids, burning wood, paper, and cloth. Covers can handle all of those. And so over in the figure 2.20, I just have highlighted class A, class B, class C, because that is the fire extinguishers we have can handle all of those. And then the second figure, figure 2.21, where it says A, B, C, or D, is the type, the actual type of fire extinguisher it is called a multi-purpose dry chemical fire extinguisher. So I have that highlighted. So just know that we use ABC fire extinguishers because of all of the possible materials or chemicals that could catch fire on a commercial vehicle.
Okay.
If we go down to the bullet point that says a burning tire. So it says a burning tire must be cooled. Lots of water may be required. So it's important to know that water can be used on, it can be used on wood, it can be used on paper, it can be used on cloth. It can also be used on tires, but we wouldn't use it anytime there's a flammable chemical, as it would just cause the flammable chemical to spread. But just know that you can use water on tires, and that might be a question. I think it's maybe a question in our practice test that asks something along those lines about what you can use to put out a tire fire. So water is appropriate. The next bullet point is 2 down from that, just position yourself upwind. So you don't want the fire extinguisher chemical to go into your face. So you're gonna, check to see which way the wind's blowing that day. Yeah.
Okay.
And make sure you're standing upwind from the fire. Fire is usually directed by wind, so you can tell which way the flames are being directed and stand upwind from that. So that is page 57. We can flip over to page 58. And I know I think talked a little bit about alcohol in another section. This kind of reiterates some of that. But let's take a look at 2.22.1, alcohol and driving. Make note of the last sentence of that first paragraph that says, for some people, 1 drink is all it takes to show signs of impairment. And then also make note of the next paragraph that says how alcohol works. If you go down 1, 2, 3 lines that starts with the rest is carried to the liver, the next sentence I have highlighted and underlined. So the liver can only process 1/3 of an ounce of alcohol per hour, which is considerably less than the alcohol in a standard drink. It says this is a fixed rate. So only time, not black coffee or a cold shower, will sober you up. So make sure you make note of that. Only time can sober you up. Also make note of this term that's down at the end of this paragraph, BAC, blood alcohol concentration, as that is the measure of alcohol in your body. So when you see that BAC, that's what that means. And that's the definition of it. Measures the amount of alcohol in your body. So also, when you look over at this chart to the right, figure 2.22, I just thought this was interesting. I don't necessarily know if this is on the test or not, but if you look at 0, all the zeros at the very top line there, so 0, and then you see over to the right, the effects, it says this is the only safe driving limit. So 0. So, so just knowing that that is specifically why we don't want to have any alcohol in our system when driving, specifically when driving a school bus. And that's covered in section 1, where we learned the 0.00% BAC is the acceptable limit for driving a school bus. Yeah. So let's look over on page 59 and just what determines blood alcohol concentration. So it says BAC is determined by the amount of alcohol you drink. More alcohol means higher BAC. It's also determined by how fast you drink, and it's determined by your weight. So make sure you just make note of those are the 3 components of determining your BAC. The amount of alcohol, how fast you drink the alcohol, and your weight. And then the next paragraph that says alcohol in the brain. Just make note of the second sentence that says the first part of the brain affected controls judgment and self-control. And so if your judgment and your self-control is impaired in any way, shape, or form, we don't want you driving a commercial vehicle, specifically children. So make note of that. That is how alcohol is affecting your brain. It's affecting your judgment and self-control. If you go down that page to 2.22.2, other drugs, if you go down to the line that says, make the driver, if you back up just a little bit, that's the beginning of that sentence. It says this could include a variety of prescription and over-the-counter drugs, specifically cold medicines, which may make the driver drowsy or otherwise affect safe driving ability. And so it's important to note that we don't take over-the-counter cold medicines if we're sick, as that might impair our driving. Okay. It's better to show up and suffer through. And actually, cold medicine doesn't actually heal you like NyQuil and Dayquil. It just does the symptoms. Yeah. And so it's better to come fight through those symptoms and not be impaired in any way. So that's all for that, page 59. Flip over to page 60, and it says, get enough sleep. So it says, and this, I think I mentioned before, this idea of sleep debt. So sleep is not like money. You can't save it up ahead of time. You can't borrow it. But just as with money, you can go into debt with it. And so they use this terminology. If you don't have enough sleep, you owe more sleep to yourself. And this debt can only be paid off by sleeping. So can't be overcome by just willpower or caffeine. And so again, if you have not gotten enough sleep to the point where you feel it is unsafe to drive, we rather you call in and we'll cover that route then to and make sure you're, no one's put in jeopardy. Okay. Then if we go down to the section that says avoid medication, here's just a reminder that many medications make you sleepy. So take a look at the label warning and make sure there's not a label warning against operating machinery or vehicles. Mm-hmm. And it says here the most common medicine of this type is the ordinary cold pill. So if you have to drive with a cold, you're better off suffering with it than the effects of the medicine. So that's repetition. So chances are they will be a question on the test since they've mentioned it a couple times. So if we go down to below 2.23.2, where it says recognize the danger signals of drowsy driving, just make note of each of those bullet points. So this is the signs of drowsy driving. you may have a question that asks you to identify the danger signals, or it may say warning signs.
Okay.
So over on page 61, 2.23.3 gives you some recommendations of what you should do should you become sleepy. And again, this is that repetition, right? So first, we stop to sleep. Second, take a nap. Third, avoid drugs. So again, reminding you to not take those like cold medicine.
Okay.
And it says, do not rely on coffee or other sources of caffeine to keep you awake. And do not count on the radio, an open window, or other tricks to keep you awake. So a reminder there. And then now the last part of this section, of section 2, talks about hazardous materials. And so 2.24 talks about hazardous material rules for all commercial drivers. So while you need to have the hazmat endorsement in order to drive certain hazardous materials, we all should be familiar with these things. And it goes through some basic things. So let's start with 2.24.2. What or why are there rules? And specifically make note of those bullet points. So the rules, the intent of these rules are to help us as drivers contain the product, communicate the risk, and ensure safe drivers and equipment. And so if we go down to, it goes into depth into each of those, right? So to contain the product, so many hazardous materials can injure or kill people upon contact. So we want to make sure that we know how to contain that and what the rules are for containment. And that's all explained specifically in that hazmat endorsement. The second is to communicate risk. And this is what we all should be familiar with this. And so to communicate risk, I have this entire paragraph highlighted. It says the shipper uses a shipping paper and a diamond-shaped hazard labels to warn dock workers and drivers of the risk. So we should be familiar with what these diamond-shaped hazard labels are. Over to the right, figure 2.24 just gives you the class name and then what's included in that. So for example, explosives. So when you see the explosive placard or sign, it means it could be ammunition, dynamite, fireworks. If you see a placard that says, or it says gases, it's talking about propane, oxygen, helium, so flammable gases. So this just gives you what the class name is that you'll see on the sign and what the possible type of chemicals are that are included in that. So, so let's go over to page 61, or sorry, 62. And it talks about regulated, list of regulated products. And the first one says placards. And so these are used to warn others of hazardous materials. Make note of that. There's signs put on the outside of a vehicle that identify the hazard class and cargo. And a placarded vehicle must have at least 4, so make note of that number, at least 4 identical placards. Then it tells you where they should be. So you should put them on the front, rear, and on both sides. So essentially, as it says, it must be readable from all 4 directions. So front, rear, and on both sides. They also have size requirements, so they must be at least 10 3/4 inches square, and they're turned upright on a point, so they form a diamond shape. So that those are our placards. And so you'll see down the where it says identification numbers, that next paragraph where it says not all vehicles carrying hazardous materials need to have placards. But the rules about that are specifically outlined in section 9. But in reference to specifically what you need to know for the general knowledge test, just make note of the last sentence of that paragraph that says if it requires placards, you cannot drive it unless your driver's license has the hazardous materials endorsement. So then if you jump down 2 paragraphs to the paragraph that starts with drivers who need, just make note of that. Drivers who need the hazmat or hazardous materials endorsement must learn all of the rules associated with transporting these chemicals. Because one of the things that you learn is outlined in the first sentence of the next paragraph, which says hazardous materials drivers must also know which products they can load together and which they cannot. And then to the right, figure 2.25 shows you all of those diamond shaped placards that you might see on the side of vehicles. And those are placards. So that wraps up section 2. That was a lot of stuff, right? For section 2. But that is the biggest section, the most information. So that wraps up that section.